And here we go again, part 2 of the sock Springer production on the reproduction system. And this time we've got the female reproductive system. Okay, and I've got another little diagram here. We've got a model that'll work with this also. But to start out with, you've got 2 ovaries. Like in the male system, you had 2 testes. And going on the inside, you have female germinal epithelium that is going to be developing into the mature ovum that's going to be coming out here. Now, a difference with the female system compared to the male system. The male system, meiosis is constantly going on once puberty is reached, and so over the lifetime you have billions and billions of sperm that are being produced there. With the female system, it's a little bit different. You already have initial things taking place, and in fact, once the female is born, each ovary is going to have about 200,000 potential developing eggs. To use simple terminology here, they can come out, which makes a total of 400,000, which, if you remember from the male system, each time sperm semen is released, and that there are about on the average 350 million of those. So numbers are significantly reduced here. And when you think about it, through the course of a lifetime with the female, there's only going to be, if a female is reaching puberty at, say, age 10 to 11, somewhere in that range, and if she wasn't pregnant at all during her lifetime, then you're going from that age 10 up into the 50s, and you're only going to have around 400 to 500 eggs that are ever going to be released. So you've got a lot of these that are going to remain there, not used during the female's lifetime. Okay, but to go back to this then, these are going to gradually develop until you get a mature ovum set up that's going to be released. And a key thing to remember here, the vas deferens with the male system was connected directly to the testes epididymis area. In the female case, where you've got the fallopian tube here, and this enlarged area is called the fimbriae, and they're little fleshy finger-like extensions out here, but they're not directly connected to the ovary. So you've got a micro space in between here, and these things are kind of moving in a wave-like motion, and they pull this ovum down into the tube. Now this is greatly exaggerated. This thing here is only about the size of a grain of salt. And these tubes here, the inside opening part there, is not much more than a couple hairs in diameter. So, to keep going down the line, ovum released, fimbriae create a current here, pulls it down through here, and eventually it's going to end up in this area here, the uterus. Along the way, to help move this along, there's a certain amount of mucus that's produced, and then if I enlarge this tube, I have little bump-like areas here called fallopian cavities that help with this egg traveling along and over. They slow down the progress so that you want to have at least 24 hours for this egg to get released here, so it's got that amount of time to be fertilized. And the egg has to be fertilized in the tube here somewhere. Once it reaches here, it's going to be too late. It can't get fertilized down in here and then develop and attach. It's just not going to work. So it has to be fertilized in this area here. These things slow it down, and you have to keep a steady progression with the way it's working its way down there. So you have tiny little hairs, cilia, that are helping. They're beating in the steady motion here and helping carry that egg down to the uterus. Now the fallopian tubes are attached to the uterus, and the big question that comes up is which ovary is releasing the egg? Do both of them release an egg at the same time? Another question comes up, do they alternate every other cycle? And those are all good questions. And to tell you the truth, I haven't found a good, solid answer for that. When my wife was first pregnant with our first child, and that she was big on reading, and she had bought 5 books dealing with pregnancies, and out of those, there were 3 different situations. One said that you had a dominant ovary that was constantly producing the eggs. Another one said that they alternated, that they felt. And another one said that it just depends on different cycles and individuals as to which one's going to be releasing an egg at what time. So we'll leave that part go. We get down here. So the egg gets to this point right here. And you have some divisions that have taken place before it gets down into the uterus. And then we get here, and the uterus is basically a pear-shaped structure, not quite like the diagram we've got here, that's made up of 3 different layers. On the outside, you've got what they call the perimetrium. On the inside, you've got the myometrium. And then you've got the endometrium on the inside here, and that's that blood-rich lining. So that once this fertilized egg, it was a zygote when it got fertilized up in here, it gets to developing, and then you end up calling it an embryo. And then later on, after the first couple of months, it'll be referred to as a fetus. But at this point here, we get here, and it's going to attach to the endometrium at some point. Then that will start developing. You've got the placenta that will start to develop around it. The umbilical cord will get attached to the lining in here. And that endometrium will develop into it's a blood-rich material that's going to be the home for the developing fetus till the end of the 9 months period. So while this is developing here, we'll end up going through the rest of the system. Towards the end down here, the base of the uterus, you've got a muscular area called the cervix. Where you hear the cervix mentioned a lot of times is prior to the baby being born. You might say that the mother is dilated 10 centimeters, which would be roughly about this much here. So, and then they talk about crowning occurring. So the baby developing, coming down head first, which would be normal. And you see the crown of the head, well, this thing would be relaxing and starting to get stretched this way. So that's a cervical area there. And then you get into the vaginal area here, or typically known as the birth canal. When you hear them use the term womb, then you're talking about this area up in here, or sometimes they call that the body of the uterus. So down into the vaginal area, and you've got some small glands here, the glands of Bartholin's, that are secreting a mucus material that helps keep this inner lining lubricated a little bit. And then you work your way down, so you get to the vaginal orifice down here. And then on the sides, you have fleshy membranes, and you've got 2 sets of those. And the smaller ones are called the labia minor, and then the larger ones, the labia major. And along with that, you also have, and I don't have it on the diagram here, but you've got a little bundle of erectile tissue with the females called the clitoris. And usually with women that haven't encountered intercourse for the first time, you have a semi-perforated membrane that's around the opening of the vaginal area, and that's called the hymen. Okay, now a lot of times that can be tattered or torn a little bit more. Females are becoming more active in sports, with horseback riding, things like that. Anytime this can be stretched, that can be tore. Okay, in very rare cases, that membrane will go across there all the way, and then that can cause other problems with the female, especially during menstruation. And let me back up on that part. Menstruation is a average 28-day cycle. It starts with the beginning of menstruation, which means that, let's imagine here, we don't have an egg here, and this lining has developed, and it keeps developing, and there's no fertilized egg that attaches. So at the end of the cycle, this material is going to begin to slough off. And once that starts to slough off, that's the beginning of menstruation. That's the beginning of a new menstrual cycle. Okay, that may take anywhere from 2 to 5 days for this lining to be completely sloughed off, the time that they call a period. And then during that time, you've got activity going on up here in the ovary, and about 14 days, if it's an average 28-day cycle, about 14 days from the beginning of menstruation till that time, you'll have an egg released and begin traveling down the tube, having to be fertilized within a 24-hour period. Okay, like I said, if that doesn't happen, then this will continue to develop for another 14 days and then be sloughed off. Now, if an individual has a 35-day cycle, okay, then you try to figure out, what's going on there. It's not in the middle of that cycle that the egg gets released. It's 14 days from the end of the cycle. So you would have menstruation occurring, and then 21 days later, you would have an egg released, which would be 2 weeks before the end of it. And then if things didn't get fertilized, then 2 weeks later, around age 35, or around the 35th day, then this membrane, this endometrium, would start to slough off again. If an individual has a 20-day cycle, which can happen, these things can vary from 20 to 40 days, then what that means is that at 6 days from the beginning of menstruation, then an egg would be released. So a question that comes up sometimes, can a person get pregnant when they're menstruating? That could happen. If the person had an egg released then, and they had a long period, say going to 6 days, and they had intercourse, and that egg would still be here, it could get fertilized and then end up attaching. So that does happen. It's a difficult situation. One thing, when they talk about natural planning, which the Catholic Church strongly endorses, and that the way females can kind of tell when the egg is being released is that the body temperature will go up. And usually the morning of ovulation, term used for when this is released, then you're talking about maybe a 1 to 1.5 degree temperature increase. Okay, now, things that happen sometimes though, if they had intercourse the day before that, that sperm would still be viable. Egg in the tube here, sperm coming up, then it could be fertilized. Okay, so a lot of different situations. We don't have the time right now to go into all of those. I wish we were in the classroom so we could go over a number of questions, but we can't. Other situations that can happen with the female system. So we're talking here. Let's go back to the pregnancy part. So once that embryo is attached here, develops, will eventually start to fill in here. You've got the individual, head will gradually tip down if things are going normal. If the baby happens to develop feet first or sitting in what we call a natural position for us, that's called a breech situation. And sometimes they'll do C-sections for those. A C-section would involve making a horizontal cut across here, that the doctor would do, and then deliver the baby. Years ago, that cut used to be made vertically, but they found out that healing of the musculature and everything else occurs a lot better if it's a horizontal cut. And a person can have more than that. In fact, my 3 children that we had, my wife had 3 C-sections. Now, sometimes you'll end up with a little scar tissue developing there, but they can always trim that up, and things heal up in a pretty natural situation. Okay, with the male system, we talked about some things that could happen, such as with syphilis and gonorrhea and different STDs. Well, this female system can be affected by those also. The big problem that you hear about sterility-wise with the female system is gonorrhea. And with the male system, we talked about damaging the urethra. With the female system, that bacteria tends to work its way up into the fallopian tubes, and it'll cause scar tissue there also. And what's happening with that is this thing here starts developing some scar tissue in there, and the egg can't get down there. And so it could be a reason for permanent sterility. Other things that can happen with syphilis, it can end up causing a number of things. One area of real big concern, though, is that if the baby is born and the mother has syphilis, then the baby can pick that up going through the birth canal. Same thing could happen with gonorrhea. We've got a model here now we're going to switch over to end up showing some other situations that can happen with the female system. One thing I want to point out right away is that you've got the fimbriae here, and you can see those little finger-like projections on there. This model is set up so that you can see those. In real life, this should be tipped down like we had on the board to end up being able to receive the egg. The egg's not going to get released and then be out here in the open and somehow magically end up in here. So it should be turned down that way. So we're looking at the setup here. The thicker area here, that's the myometrium. Okay, inside here then, where you'd have things developing, would be your endometrium. And in these situations, let me get a little pointer here, you can end up with polyps developing. Commonly you hear about polyps developing in the large intestine, but they're little growths, and they can develop on the inside of the uterus here. You can end up with a cancerous situation here. This would be called, it could be called a carcinoma or a sarcoma. You can end up with a fibroid type tumor on the inside here, or developing even into the musculature of the uterus this way. Those can end up causing serious problems. When they talk about cervical cancer, this is that little muscular area here at the base of the uterus. They can end up having problems. When they do pap smears, they're checking for that type of situation. The little dark specks that you see are the result of endometriosis. And what happens there is due to a situation here during menstruation, for that material, that endometrial lining, to be forced down into the vaginal area and then out of the body, then this thing has to contract. So when you hear about a lady having cramps, this is only being used once a month. And so if the uterus is resting for that period of time and then starts to contract to force that tissue down there, then it's like any muscle in the body. Once you use it over a number of times, you start to get to be sore. And so that's what's happening with the cramps. But sometimes those cramps may force some of that little tissue out the fallopian tube past the fimbrate and can end up in the cavity in the lower abdominal area. So you can end up with little bits of that tissue attaching to the uterus here, or it could even attach to the small intestine, large intestine, and start to develop there. Could become a very painful situation, and it seems to affect some women more than others. For a lot of women, it doesn't affect them at all. And then finally, one more situation that can occur with the female system is if you see these little lumps here on the ovary, those would be ovarian cysts. Now, they may be very small and just randomly appear and then go away. Sometimes they can get really large and end up rupturing. Sometimes they can get extremely large. In the case of my wife, a number of years ago, she was experiencing some severe abdominal cramping and going in, and they couldn't quite figure out till they did an ultrasound, and her one ovary had ended up increasing to the size of a good-sized grapefruit, and consequently had to go in and end up removing it, which is a hysterectomy, or a radical hysterectomy, I guess would be the case of removing the ovaries. Regular hysterectomy would be if, in case somebody had severe cancer and things going on and they ended up removing the uterus. And with that, we will conclude our explanation of the female reproductive system, and hopefully, I've covered a few areas that people may have questions about. There are a lot of different areas, though, that for discussion and different situations that can happen. I mean, there's dozens of different conditions, both the male and the female systems. But hopefully this enlightens you a little bit about the male and the female reproductive systems. Thank you.